Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a discussion today with Coach Linda Blade. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good morning, Beth. Great to be with you. Well, what should I say? I am a longtime coach in track and field and also a sport performance professional. And I work in the city of Edmonton, which is up in Alberta in Canada. And I used to be an athlete in track and field, a heptathlon. It was in the 80s, and I competed for University of Maryland. And in the time of Jackie Joyner, I got to compete with Jackie Joyner Kersey. So I have a long history in track and field, but also a PhD in kinesiology and sports sciences, which is biology based. And so, I have a lot of just sport background. And then in 2014, I was elected as president of our state, our provincial track and field association. And so, I have a lot of involvement in leadership, in program planning, in policy development, and still coaching.
That's awesome. And it's my understanding that you're helping create some policies up there to help prevent against males self-IDing into female sports.
Yeah, I like to think of it as preserving female sports. So, I mean, it's not really, there's nothing we're doing literally to the male section. We're keeping the male section as it is, and we're keeping the female section as it is. So basically, we compete in sport on the basis of biological sex. We don't categorize athletes based on, their religion or based on what political party they voted for or whatever ideology is in their brain. We don't care. That's the beauty of sport, actually. The beauty of sport is that you don't actually have to worry about your personal ideas and beliefs. You come to the sport field, you leave all that behind, and you compete as a male or a female, because that's the meaning of sport. Who's the best male? Who's the best female? And those are categories. Those are distinct bimodal categories. So really, we're just setting policy that, reinforces the fact that when you sign up for our sport, you sign up on the basis of male or female. And there is a code of conduct involved. We're not allowed to bully anybody, so we have to respect everybody. But we also have a policy that you're not allowed to misrepresent yourself. So you can't say, that you're a different age. You can't say, that you can't say that you're with another club when you're with a different team. So there's a lot of things you're not allowed to do. And one of those things is not allowed to misrepresent what biological sex you are. And we feel like that is actually the best way to go in sport. Otherwise, it gets really confusing. And actually, if we don't do that, women's sport in particular will be finished, because we have to make sure, since women are biologically built differently than males, we need to keep them in their own category.
You're right. Linda, what first brought you to this forefront of the transgender movement and males trying to invade female sports?
Yeah, it happened around 2018, about January of that year. I was asked to sit on a gender policy committee at the national level in Canada, particularly with respect to Athletics Canada, the governing body of our sport. And I'm one of the few provincial presidents who happens to be a woman. So it kind of made sense. If you're going to have a gender committee, you have to have male presidents and female presidents and everybody at the table, which I thought was great. And so I had no problem volunteering for it. I thought it was great. They asked us to look at some documents that the federal government of Canada was pushing as far as inclusion in sport. And I, with my biology and sport background, I'm looking at these policies and these proposals, and my heart sunk, because all of a sudden I realized they're asking us to do away with the requirement of biological sex, and they're asking us to allow people to self-ID in sport in whatever sex category they identify with. And immediately, of course, all the alarm bells start going off in my head, because that's just not going to work. Because I immediately saw that there could be boys who, for whatever reason, think of themselves as girls, and they would go into a girls' race, and it would be discriminating against the girls. So I was really confused, because in Canada, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And one of the things that it says in there is that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. So I didn't know what this was about. I just, I was really, really green and new to this area. And I had never really heard of such madness. And it kind of started to make me, steam started coming out of my ears. And I asked the people around me, like, can't you see how obvious that this is not going to work? And they all stood there and looked at me like, well, sorry, we're just going to have to accept it because that's the law. And I'm thinking, no, that's not the law. That's not the law. I don't know what's going on here. So I thought, surely to goodness, if I appealed back, if I go back and look at the international policy, it's going to all be on our side. Like, surely the Olympic Committee would,
One would
support.
assume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I start digging, and I go to the IOC guidelines. And I couldn't even believe what I was reading. And this was obviously a policy they brought in at 2015. And I'm sitting in my office here, and I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, has the world actually gone crazy? Like, what is this? What is this? And I had nobody around me agreeing with me. It was just me, association president, and all these people around me, other presidents and national leaders, are saying, well, you're being a bigot if you don't accept this. And I remember a couple of meetings where I'm asking why we're doing this, and they were saying how it's to encourage inclusion and safety. And I'm thinking, well, how can that be inclusive? The minute you allow a male in a female sport, that's not inclusive anymore. You're actually excluding women. And then, and if it's a contact sport, it's not even safe. I mean, that's instantly obvious to anybody who's in sport. So I had a feeling that instantly, actually, that this is going much deeper into society than I could have possibly comprehended at that moment. And the other thing they said, that there was a little limited amount of time, to sort of work this out before it becomes a law or a rule. So I started emailing people, I started calling people, and I called the head of the Canadian Center for Ethics of Sport. And this was the entity in Canada. It's like a big national organization that looks at ethics for sport. So originally it was for non-doping, to the fight against doping, okay. Especially after Ben Johnson, our sprinter in Seoul Olympics. And and so their main thing has been non-doping. And so I go to that was the source document, that they had a working group where they came up with these guidelines that self-ID is paramount above all things. And so I called the president of that organization. I said, how can this be true? And I said the same thing as I just told you. It's not inclusive. It's not safe. Oh, you're blowing this out of proportion. He said, well, and at that point I thought, like, really, everybody's in denial here. Like, what is going on? So I kind of just, I started tweeting on my own. I started getting a little outraged. So I thought, I'm just going to float some of these ideas on Twitter and just see, what happens, because I can't possibly be the only one thinking this, right? And so I came out clearly as gender critical, and I mean, just in my own innocent way. I didn't know. And then all of a sudden, I had a few things. I put charts, and I was making pictures and diagrams about how, justice, human rights for men outweighs human rights for women. Met you in one of those tweets or those groups, and then you formed Save Women's Sports, and now here we are. And you've done so well. Within 1 year, it took you 1 year to get to a point where you have bills, literally Save Women's Sports bills, being introduced into the state legislatures. You've done so much. And I am so proud, really, to have known you from the beginning, because I've seen how much progress that you have made in 1 year. And look at, I mean, now with this legal case happening in Connecticut with the girls, they're looking like they are getting on top of things and maybe going to succeed in preserving, at the state level, at the legal level, Title IX, which is important for women and girls, which was one of the reasons also why I want to be speaking out, because I am the beneficiary of Title IX in the 80s. It was 8 years after Title IX was brought into law that I got my full scholarship in the States to be able to study and to be able to compete as a female athlete. And that was fundamental to who I am today. So I feel like I have had my turn. And thanks to you and so many women in the US, in the USA, Wolf, and all these people fighting for an alliance for defending freedom, all of these different groups, doesn't matter if they're left, right, center. I mean, this movement cannot be a purity test. We have no time for that.
Exactly.
We have to have everybody on board and all hands on deck to save Title IX. And so
It's
this is really
crucial.
encouraging. It's really crucial. It's very important. And it looks like Attorney General Barr just yesterday had an opinion that agrees with our position, with me, which is so encouraging. And so I would say that we live in hard times, but amazing times, really, if we can all fight this battle together. And so I'm just doing my little bit on the ground, but let me pivot to just saying then, what do we do with our language? Because I don't even want to call it transgender, because, you know, transgender, that's such a catch-all phrase. And I've come to understand through studying it deeply, trying to be fair and deeply concerned about their rights and the rights of women and girls. For my own association, I've been really looking at the different causes and different pathways to transgender and the different things that create or are labeled transgender, and they're not all the same. The reason a teenage girl transitions is completely different than the reason why a 40-year-old male would. I mean, they're all different, and really, in terms of Canadian law, it comes back to self-ID. It's not for me to say, and it's not for any of us to say whether someone's transgender or not. I think the only thing that we can do in sport as leaders in sport is to say, look, what are we going to do about people, what they say about themselves? So self-ID. And there has to be some sort of standard on what is the identity that we're looking at when you come to our sport. And
Right,
really,
and
it's
it
so
needs to be the sexes. It needs to be the two
exactly,
sexes and not
exactly,
self-ID or
yeah,
gender identity. Something
exactly. I
that's
mean,
immutable.
well, and nobody has really defined, other than social role play, what is a gender identity anyway, because it keeps getting split into smaller and smaller groups and smaller individual differences, to the point where I now see people like Blair White and other transgender people arguing who is transgender and who isn't, even within that whole umbrella group. There is no consensus on what it even means to be trans, or what a gender thing is.
Yes,
Gender
and now
queer.
we're seeing this trend of conflating the two words of sex and
Yeah,
gender identity, trying to conflate
yeah,
the two, and they're very not the same. And things like here in America with the Equality Act that was looming
yeah.
overhead would have simply put gender identity in place of sex in all of our federal laws.
Well, let's
So we're
face it,
really lucky that we do have the case in the Title IX case in Connecticut, and are working towards some solutions to save women's rights and protect our spaces, not only our playing field.
yes, and what I was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt you there for a moment, but the Supreme Court, though, still hasn't made that ultimate ruling on what the meaning of the word sex is. We're waiting for that with bated breath, because it really matters. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg first used the word gender in law in the 70s, according to the description we saw in the letter from Attorney General Barr yesterday, very clearly that meant biological sex. At that time, it meant biological sex for the purposes of Title IX, for the purposes of rights. And for somebody to come along and suddenly say, well, the word sex doesn't mean that anymore. The word sex doesn't mean whatever your biology or genetics is. The word sex now means some sort of role you want to play in society. It's just too diffuse. That is not a definition. That is not helpful. And in fact, when I see these arguments happening online and on YouTube and I'm following, trying to understand, and every time I think I've got it, I think I understand it, they move it to the next level where it doesn't mean what it did last week. And so it is literally gender fluid. I mean, literally that word is very accurate, fluid. There is no actual definition. And it's untenable to expect everybody in society and organizations like mine to make a ruling as if that's the key cornerstone of an identity when it keeps shifting. And what it turns out to be is, if you take it to the nth degree, every single one of the however many people on this planet, 7-8 billion people, whatever it is, every single one of us has our own identity. And we can't have 7 billion categories in sport.
We have to define it, yes, with definable, definite terms.
That's the only way. How else are we going to do it? I really care, because for the authentic trans person who wants to be participating in sport, and we want to include them, there has to be a way that we can include them, that we have a sport to include them into. If we don't have definitions about the meaning of a competition or what a category is, there is no sport. So there's no point in them wanting to be included in sport when there's not going to be any sport. If we can't have these categories, what sport's going to be? Because the whole point is, when you compete in sport, you're saying, who's the best woman in this particular activity? Woman. Who's the best male in this particular activity? The best way, I think, to express a trans identity in sport, literally, is to have, if it's let's say a gentleman in a dress, if he identifies as she, we say, so-and-so, she is in the men's race running in women's clothing. How much more identifying is it than to do that? If you are male and you're running in women's clothing, and we respect you for that, we allow you to do that. You can wear whatever you want. Now you're identified. Now you are identified. You're being included in a race where you belong biologically, but you're also identified as your gender identity. And isn't that something to celebrate? If we erase the women's category, whereby all the males who identify as women will go into some category called women, but it's all just one category, it's all full of men. They're not identifying in any way at all. If there's no identity there.
Exactly. If we allow them in, there will no longer be women's sports. There'll be male sports, and there'll be co-ed sports.
And so it doesn't give them an opportunity to identify as anything else but a man in a dress, which we can already accommodate in the male section. So
exactly.
It's just like we're going through an exercise that's pointless, because we can include everybody. They already have the rights to be in sports. And so I say, whatever your self-ID ideology is, and we couldn't call it self-ID, I'm not going to call it trans, because I don't even know what that word means. Because there might be a completely different category come along that's, zany category, something, and then you just have to include that person's identity somehow. But it doesn't matter. That's what I said in the beginning. Ideology doesn't matter in sport. If you're a communist, if you're a fascist, if you're a Democrat, if you're a Republican, if whatever it is, you can leave that all behind and run your race.
Right.
That's so beautiful. It's all it is. And people say, well, these people are so many. If we don't allow them to participate. They're very suicidal. If you don't let them in your sport, maybe they'll commit suicide. I just feel like that's emotional hijacking. That's just ridiculous.
Most definitely. There's a lot of gaslighting going on the other side and grooming younger generations into accepting this as normal when they don't need to. They shouldn't accept a male in their bathroom or on their
Right.
sports team or in their locker room by surprise. It should not
Yeah.
be the new normal. And if we
We
don't
can
step up, it
accommodate.
very well could be. And we're grateful for people like you, Linda, on you're like a Twitter warrior, I would say, helping other people create a safe space to speak
Yeah.
up. Although in these platforms of social media, we're consistently seeing ourselves being censored lately. And not only
Yeah.
on social media, but in actual physical platforms like Wolf, for example, trying to hold meetings in public libraries, or Megan Murphy up there in Canada and running into trouble with the transgender rights activists, if we could say men's rights activists, even having issues with women gathering and speaking their minds. I think you were a part of an event that got canceled here, unfortunately, because of the coronavirus. Can you tell us a bit about what that was? And is that postponed now?
Yeah, it was called GIDYVR, and it was going to be held in Vancouver in the Vancouver Public Library in a conference room that was rented by a women's group. And it was going to be Megan Murphy, myself, Heather Mason, who's very strong. She's a ex-convict who is very concerned about male bodies in female prisons, and especially violent men, that are, convicted killers and rapists
Yeah, it's not
you know,
exactly related to sports, but it is related
yeah,
with this transgender movement, that it seems to be a
yeah,
bunch of violent males in
yeah,
prisons now transitioning gender and being put in with women. And now I've even seen it close to home, just a couple states away from me, that one of them raped a woman, and it's becoming a
yeah.
common occurrence. And it's sad. It's very
Well,
sad.
it's a complete it's a complete absence of leadership in top echelons of government and these organizations who make these decisions. Um, it really, in Canada, we have Bill C-16, which was the one that Jordan Peterson got all up in arms about, which launched Jordan Peterson's career about the pronouns. But now we see it's gone so much further. Organizations in sports and in prisons are basically feeling like they're hand tied because the government said you have to recognize gender identity. They interpret it to mean that those men can go into the women's spaces. That's not what the government bill necessarily said. That's everybody's interpretation trying to genuflect before a new ideology. So the interpretation of what that law means is the problem. And it's a faulty interpretation at the highest levels of leadership, because they're frightened, or they just want to fit in. They want to have the woke points, or they want to have a pat on the back that they're being inclusive and equitable, and they're for all these things. But it's a mantra that's not true in reality. And so when you get down to ground level where I am, and I'm just dealing with the actual competitions on the ground with boys and girls and young up and coming athletes, this is where the rubber meets the road. And the people, the wardens working in the prisons, it's the same thing. The rubber meets the road when all of a sudden a male body shows up and wants to be in a prison cell with a vulnerable woman. And so it's funny how this movement has forced what I call leadership from the ground. So the leadership isn't happening at the top. Those people are just virtue signaling, and they can say whatever they want, and they can make all these policy pronouncements, but it's the people on the ground. It's just like with the COVID. President Trump, anybody can say what they want about, at the beginning, and everybody wasn't taking it seriously, but it's the medical worker on the ward that ends up having to find a ventilator and find innovative ways to make more ventilators. And that's leadership from the ground. And we have a lot of that. And this time of life, whether it's an ideology we're combating, or a virus, it requires individual people at ground level to step up and say, no, the reality is this, right? So you have to, and then the leaders, like, to the credit of some of the leadership, they change their mind, they change their tune. And I think it's the same thing going on here. If those
Yeah.
on the ground, put their stake in the ground and say, this far and no further, we're not doing it. We're doing what we say and what we see as the right thing. Those people in leadership change their minds and have to re-examine their policies. And I guess, unfortunately, that's where we're at this moment. So going back to the event in Vancouver, what I found astounding was that instantly, it's just like an instant reaction. All of the trans activists in that city, even the ones, especially the ones who are so supportive of JY, and they're immediately the ones trying to cancel our event, always. Like, they know, and they're proving through their actions that they know that if we are allowed to speak and if we are allowed to make our opinions heard, they are weak. Otherwise, why would they even bother? Why would just ignore the event? Go about your life as a trans person, ignore the event. Why do you want to kick women out of a meeting? Like, it's happening in the UK, it's happening wherever we go. And these people who are acting, they want us to accept them as women, they show up with baseball bats. Like, they're still behaving as testosterone filled men. Like, they're proving our point, really. Right.
Exactly.
And it's so interesting. So anyway, we didn't get to have that event because of the coronavirus, not because of the activists. But I was really hoping some of them would show up so I could ask them questions too, because I mean, they need to be held to account. It can't just be like anybody with a T who identifies with a T is an angelic being who can do no wrong, and we're supposed to all just believe what they say and buy into what they say and what they claim. There has to be a responsibility on their part.
There needs to be responsibility. There needs to be an honest debate. And when we come to that debate with our truth, there won't be a debate. Then they will be shut down, and they will see that, yes, their money has gotten them power, but there is a large amount of power when it comes to honesty.
Exactly.
I think they are just attacking back because that's the final reserves. There is no debate. There is male and female. We're not going to play this large scale game of let's pretend.
Yes. And what I keep hearing is people feel helpless because they look at the billionaires supporting the trans movement, all the money going into ACLU, all the money that's going into Human Rights Coalition. You look at their financial statements, it's astounding the amount of money involved in pushing that ideology. But I actually, at the end of the day, when I think about it, I almost feel sorry for them because because they're spending billions, and you know what's going to happen? Biology will just shrug. Biology shrugs. Nothing changes. Biology has been around for all this time. And just because somebody comes along and throws $1 billion at some faulty idea,
Right.
it doesn't mean anything. Like, look at what happened with coronavirus. That is biology in action. All of a sudden, the markets collapse. All of a sudden, there's a $2 trillion spending package by the U.S. government, and anything that's even $1 billion fails in comparison. Because if something's not in keeping with biology, it's not going to succeed. Biology shrugs its shoulders at our ideas if they're not truth. And if we don't acknowledge biology, this generation will come and go. Corona could wipe us all out. Guess what? Biology would still be there, ticking along. It doesn't care.
Exactly. It is often daunting to think about the money, and it's sad to think how much money is wasted trying to push this ideology. And they're really using sports as a tool. You've used a good term in some interviews before. It is not the right place for psychosocial fixes, right? It's not an experiment. We're not
Yeah.
an experiment. We need
Yeah.
safe, sex segregated sports. And talking about the money, we really saw this come out recently with the bill HB 500 in Idaho, which is
Mm.
the first bit of legislation that is working to preserve female sports that has made it all the way to a governor's desk.
Yeah.
And this week now, any second, we're waiting to hear back on if the governor signs or vetoes it. And we're seeing an extreme amount of pressure for him to veto it from the Human Rights Campaign, the
Yeah.
ACLU, even the Women's Sports Foundation. And
Yeah.
it's mind boggling, and it's just absurd to me that someone like the
Yeah.
Women's Sports Foundation would support males competing as females. And that's part of the reason why I started Save Women's Sports after experiencing the male protesting my powerlifting competition. It's because I started looking up and finding the Women's Law Center, all these different women's places are pushing this ideology, and it's just not right.
Right. And so I what I'm seeing in Canada is the same thing. There's a national body that gets a lot of funding from the Canadian government called the Canadian Association for the Advancement of Women in Sport, cause. And they're bought in completely to it because I think it's tied to their funding, and they're in a hard place because they want the funding to keep their bureaucracy going, because all these groups, they've created these massive organizations that require their funding to continue, and this ideology now, their funding is contingent on the ideology, so they have to try to put this round peg in a square hole or vice versa, and it's not working. And those are the women that go across Canada and actually go to our meetings, because it's powerful to have a woman come in and say you should allow this person in your sport, and the government looks at what they're doing and they say, well, if the cause group is in favor of this, why can't all the women on the ground be in favor of this? But cause isn't representing the women on the ground anymore. In this moment, they've actually, by doing that, by actually supporting male bodies and female sports, cause has cut its ties to the grassroots, in my opinion. And it was interesting because I called them out a couple times on Twitter, and now I notice they're not on Twitter anymore at all. Like, and I know from background conversations at national competitions that there is a little bit of there's a there's a big conversation going on within cause that we're probably not aware of, that I don't think everybody within the organization itself sees this as viable. But I
I
really
think
believe, I'm guessing that it's a trade-off between their existence as an organization and the funding they get versus truly representing women and girls.
Yeah, and it's crazy how it always comes back to the money. It seems like in this movement,
Yeah.
who has the
Yeah.
most money, and it's follow the money. And for those who
Mm-hmm.
haven't discovered the history so much about all of this, we can refer them to Jennifer Bilik's blog, the 11th
Yeah,
hour
that's a good
blog.com.
one. Yeah.
She has written some amazing articles that have been published all over about one of them is the rich white men that are funding the transgender movement, and just how we got to this place. It's a good reference for some of you out
Absolutely.
there.
I love Jennifer's posts. Shout out to Jennifer, if you're watching this, because you know a lot about the background of what's going on behind the ideology and what has pushed it, and maybe what the ultimate goal is. But you know, Beth, in sports, I really don't see. I don't think they even see what the end point is in sport, because they wouldn't be doing it if they thought they were going to be destroying sport, or maybe they are, but maybe they're just going to destroy sport to prove a point, at least destroy women's sport. But I really believe that they haven't really thought it through. And that's why we need to have these conversations. That's why we need to have these meetings in public libraries. That's why we have to share ideas, because if they're legitimately concerned about including trans people or self-ID people, like, again, I don't know what trans means exactly, but self-ID people, um, then we have to be able to have meetings where we all respect each other's opinions, and we can point out that, sport isn't going to last if you do that. And, our officials are going to be at risk. everybody's going to be at risk if we start setting it up where it violates some sort of law, right? So I don't think, like, a lot of our officials in the sport, even in track and field, are women. I think that you would even lose a lot of capacity to host competitions if you just wrote off all the women and push them all out. So, like, for a lot of little kids, you wouldn't even have competitions anymore. And I've said before, I did a podcast with Megan Murphy, and I've done a number of other ones, and I am sticking to my guns that this is the hill I die on, because if we can't, draw the line here on biological categories, there is really no point for me to be coaching, because sport isn't sport at that point, at least for girls and women. But for me, I've had my chance. I've enjoyed sport. I really did respect the Olympic movement many years ago. I'm having a hard time respecting them now with their lack of leadership in this area, and their reticence and their unwillingness to listen to women and girls. And by the way, I'm wearing my Tokyo baseball shirt. It's actually should have been the opening day of Major League Baseball, and Tokyo has been, been postponed. And so here it is. Like, this is the hill I die on, because there just wouldn't be any point in my involvement in sport if this rule goes through. Or
Can
if
we
somehow
backtrack a second and clarify for those watching that aren't familiar with what exactly those rules that got changed in the Olympics in 2015 were and what they did, what they allow?
I used to believe in the International Olympic Committee, and then I looked at their rules, and they literally did the following. In 2015, the IOC came up with a rule very quietly. They didn't really announce it broadly. They didn't consult with women. Their rule is that a male can identify as a female and compete in the Olympic Games as long as they comply with only two requirements. The one requirement is that they live as a woman for a year, 12 months, and during that time reduce their hormone levels down to 10 nanomoles per liter, which is still 30 times higher than what most women have as their testosterone levels. But anyway, so if a trans person gets, or a self-ID person gets their hormones down to 10 nanomoles per liter, then presumably after a year, they should be allowed to qualify for the Olympic Games and compete in women's sport. And because of the 1 year delay, and because the rule was instantiated in 2015, nobody had time to self-ID into the Rio Olympics. So the Tokyo Olympic Games would be the first ones that trans people or male who identify as females.
Glad you clarified that. Yeah, it'll be the first time unadulterated
that they will be allowed into the sport. So there's the possibility in Tokyo 2020 that we're going to see male bodies getting medals on female podiums. I mean, it might not happen, but the possibility is clearly there because of the lack of leadership by the IOC and understanding the implications of this rule. And for 2019, all of 2019, there were so many women doing petitions, writing letters, having meetings, sending tweets and social media messages to the IOC, and they have said nothing. So they have shown no leadership at all in this, and it's very disappointing. I used to have a lot of respect for the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic movement. It's what drives my incentive to coach, partly, other than just I like sports, but it's hugely disappointing for me to see the lack of leadership right now that exists right now in the International Olympic Committee executive.
And we're trying to put pressure on them. They recently announced that they were not going to make a any adjustments to their transgender policy until after the games, but that was before they postponed them till 2021. So now we have a whole nother year to lobby and put more pressure on them. And we have even whole countries, like the head of the Australian Olympic Committee wants them to prevent
to
males
change the
from
policy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think it's all up to us, ground level, like you keep coming back to join together. And it doesn't matter where we are. Let's all join hands on this one issue.
And that's, by the way, I'm wearing my Tokyo shirt, baseball shirt, for two reasons. I want to say hi to Tokyo and the people in Japan. And I want to also say, you know, too bad for Major League Baseball that they couldn't start today, because it would have been nice to have that. But obviously we know why with the coronavirus. But I will say the coronavirus has given us time, a chance to save Tokyo 2020. It's given us a chance to save Tokyo and Japan from the humiliation of having the whole world laugh at the sight of a male body on a female podium. We're trying so hard at the ground level, leadership from the ground, for the whole country of Japan. You know, I appeal to them, like, to understand that this is going to make everybody, all those $30 billion that they spent on launching and hosting this big event, and for what? To be laughed at by the world, for TVs to be clicking off because you see a male body in a female sport?
How shameful. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
How shameful it will be for them.
Humiliating. So
Yes.
humiliating for
We
Japan.
saw
And
how
I don't think they realize.
We saw how ridiculous it looks when you have someone like Laurel Hubbard standing atop the women's weightlifting platform. It's ridiculous. Do they really want that shame brought upon their country? Exactly.
They don't. But I think it would be really great if anybody in Japan is listening to this and really starts to ask its leaders whether this is a policy that they would like to see being enacted on their territory, because the IOC has shown us that they're not willing to lead. They're so, I don't know what happened there. I don't know if it's the money. I don't know if it's the human rights stuff. I don't know what is going on. But the IOC has been completely unresponsive to this thing that could ruin their own brand. Think about that.
Oh, yeah. Who's going to want to watch when it's a bunch of males atop the women's platform? What's the point of watching that?
It just baffles my mind. Like, I can't reconcile this, Beth. I can't reconcile it. I know they care about their brand. I know they care about the Olympic Games. I know they care in some ways about Japan having a good games. And I know all the Japanese people and the Japanese Olympic Organizing Committee cares. And yet this silly little thing could ruin it for all of them. It's amazing to me.
There, Linda.
Yeah. So
yeah, we plead with watching that can help us get attention to those that matter in the IOC and anyone across the world to start tagging, tweeting, write letters, call. On the Save Women's Sports website, on the Take Action tab, you can find the phone numbers to find your local and the International Olympic Committee phone numbers. Take action. That's how we can make change. Just make your voice heard. It doesn't matter how small it is or how much money you have or if you stumble when you speak, just speak.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I feel like we've been given a gift of another year to try to do something about this, to save the Olympic Games, to save women's sport and save Tokyo 2020. And I really think that if there's any way we can do it, take maximum advantage of this time to to say to Japan, like, we care. We don't want your Olympics to go down in history as like a shameful moment or something. Like, it has to be something we all celebrate together. And I really look forward to it, actually. I hope maybe 2020 can be like the pivotal year where the IOC just decides, listen, we understand this isn't going to work. Let's suspend the policy for a while. Let's truly consult the way rugby did a month ago. World Rugby did a
And
good
when
job.
they do consult, let's have some women on the board this time.
Yes.
There's
yes.
not been much representation of female athletes. These boards and these people making decisions are mainly males, and then males self-IDing as females. And I just don't see that as fair. We need a well-balanced and represented, honest debate when it comes to these issues.
Yes, and I will say the women who are on the Olympic Committee, the International Olympic Committee, they are so frightened of losing their spot because it's such a privilege to be on that group. I just feel like it's too much for those women who are currently sitting there to speak up about this, and it's sad. But I think that's everybody's. I mean, the men are frightened too. So again, leadership from the bottom, leadership from the ground. That's the only way this is going to change. Leadership from the Japanese citizen, leadership for people who just are willing to take back control of sport and sport policy from the ground level. That's the only way it can be done. I'm convinced, because too many of those people at the top are just captured by the ideology, by the big money involved, and they don't want to admit they made a mistake. And they need to be able to say, look, we probably rushed this, and we shouldn't have rushed into this.
Right. Well, maybe we can all start by using hashtag Save Tokyo 2020.
Yeah. Yep. Save Tokyo 2020. Hashtag Save Tokyo 2020. It's so important. Or just say save and then hashtag Tokyo 2020. Either way, but that needs to be crowdsourced from all the people in the world who care about sports, and organizations like yours to keep plugging away and to be the focal points and places where we can collect resources and find out the information and find out the strategies about what we can do.
Now, we're glad to have expanded this far and to be such a platform and to give women like you a chance to speak out when
Thank you.
Formal media seems to not share our opinions.
Yeah, I am so appreciative of any group that, I am amazed that I've even been given the voice that I've been given. It's just little old me at the beginning, not sure what to say or who to go to. But I do have, some representation. I represent about 3,500 athletes as far as being president of this local place. So I do have a responsibility as well. So it's not just me sort of willy-nilly, just sort of randomly trying to be important or anything. I'd rather not have this conversation, actually. I'd rather not have to fight this fight. I'd rather just I'd rather just be down in the trenches coaching like I have been for the last 25 years and not worry about these kinds of policies. But when you come for me and my athletes, sorry, I have a responsibility to represent them well and to represent them with dignity and fairness and make sure that we preserve what we have, which is a very good thing. Sport's really good. Sport is really good. So we have to preserve that, and it's my responsibility so far to do that. Now, again, if everything changes, it's me walking away because this is the hill I die on. This is as far as it goes.
Well, I think we all need to get our stake out and plant it in the ground with you, alongside you. I'm grateful and besides that.
I appreciate
and
it.
I'm very grateful for your time today. Is there anything you'd like to say in closing?
No, just stay safe, everybody. Be responsible, self-isolate. Let's get through this quickly so we can get back to having our sports and our competitions, and I'm looking forward to getting back into action. My athletes are as well. So we're all just doing the best we can, and I think you guys are too, everybody out there. And if anybody's sick, stay well. I wish you well. God bless you, and have a great recovery, if at all possible.
That's awesome. I think we all feel the same way right now, this virus.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Linda.
Yes, we'll see.